Meanwhile, the EU is being increasingly criticised for its hostility towards Russia and rejection of realities on the ground. Now, renowned economist and UN senior advisor Jeffrey Sachs expressed some rather harsh remarks to European officials in Brussels.
In America, if you don't like the other side, you don't negotiate with them, you try to overthrow them. Preferably covertly. If it doesn't work covertly, you do it overtly. You always say it's not our fault, they're the aggressor, they're the other side, they're Hitler. That comes up every 2 or 3 years. We've been experiencing this foreign policy for now essentially 33 years. Europe has paid a heavy price for this, because Europe has not had any foreign policy during this period that I can figure out. No voice, no unity, no clarity, no European interests, only American loyalty. I advise the Ukrainians, I'm not anti-Ukrainian, I'm pro-Ukrainian completely. I said, save your lives, save your sovereignty, save your territory, be neutral. Don't listen to the Americans. I repeated to them the famous adage of Henry Kissinger: to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. Please don't have American officials as head of Europe. Have European officials. Please. Have a European foreign policy.
Right, let's head over now to our special studio where our very own Roy Souchet will be talking to a very special guest, Mr. Jeffrey Sachs himself. Rory, good afternoon. Exciting times indeed. Over to you now, Mr.
Indeed.
Jeffrey Sachs.
Murad, thank you very much for that indeed. You know, there is a shortage of voices of reason in the world, although there are some who are optimistic that we are witnessing perhaps a return to common sense. One of those loudest voices on the very front line is from the man you just heard. And it's a great privilege and a great honor to welcome him here onto the channel on RT International. Columbia University professor, economist, public policy analyst, but the Hill in Washington likes to call you a Kremlin mouthpiece. Hello, Jeffrey Sachs.
Good to be with you. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. It's great to have you on the program. You know, that speech you just gave the other day at the EU Parliament, it was a bit of a scorched earth speech, I've got to tell you. I mean, you really socked it to them there, Jeffrey. Was it just a case of stone-cold stares, or did you get any love from those in attendance?
Well, from those in attendance, things were fine. It's those that weren't in attendance that I'm hoping I make some contact with. Europe, as I emphasized, it needs to have a European foreign policy. It needs to re-engage with Russia. It needs to have normal diplomacy. Europe is a region of 450 million people in the Union, a $20 trillion economy, complementary to the Russian economy. They should be trading and mutually prosperous. Instead, everything's broken down, and the hate talk is nonstop. So that was the point that I was making. Get back to something that can possibly work for everybody.
Yeah, some kind of return to common sense. You know, we're hoping. But that speech you gave, Jeffrey, at the EU Parliament, it sent ripples. It sent ripples around the world. I've seen so many people reacting to this. And I just want to say on a personal level, I really admire the work that you've been doing. You've been such a busy man these days, on air, online, at the EU Parliament. You didn't just give your scorched earth speech at the EU Parliament. You've been drilling down on Europe's foreign policy. Of course, as Trump and J.D. Vance have taken a hammer to these traditional ties across the Atlantic. What are your expectations going forward for Europe, Jeffrey? Do you think it really can be independent of Washington?
I think it can and should be, although I got an email just a few minutes ago by a very knowledgeable person said, "You're dreaming. Europe will never be unified." You know, I don't think we should ever say never about foreign policy and about what's possible. This is one of my understandings, partly from my own lifetime experience, partly from my reading of history, partly from the events of just the last few weeks. Who would have thought that the United States and Russia would be in a real rapprochement, which they are. Well, I would have, by the way, because I kept saying during the Biden administration, you're making a terrible mistake. This is a complete blunder. There's no reason for this war. There's no reason for the breakdown of relations. And I think that what Donald Trump said as he came into office was he doesn't want to hold the losing hand that Biden was playing.
Right.
So to my mind, things can change. Europe, it got trapped by following the United States in a blind kind of way, just trying to be the great cheerleader of U.S. hegemony. Obviously, the whole U.S. approach, the unipolar approach, was delusional. It's ended. Now Europe has to get its act together. Is it possible? It is not only possible, I even think it's going to happen, because what else is Europe going to do? Just be 27 bickering, divided countries in a world today where actual scale and cooperation means a tremendous amount for one's economy, for one's politics, and for one's geopolitics and security. I think they'll get their act together.
Meantime, and by the way, I appreciate your optimism. I do admire it, Jeffrey. But, we've got this new administration back in the White House now. And, let's not forget that the U.S. financed the Maidan coup of 2014. And so, as you say, your typical European lapdogs became the cheerleaders for what was then the U.S. administration. But now the master has changed. And some are saying the lapdogs don't know who to wag their tails for anymore. Meantime, it looks like Trump is all but done with Ukraine. He's looking for peace. He's looking to make a quick buck on the mineral resources, as Europe looks poised to try and continue the war. Jeffrey, can you just help me get my head around that, please?
Well, it's hard to get one's head around because Europe cannot continue the war. Ukraine cannot continue the war. In the bottom line, what happened during the last 30 years, I'm going to put it, because this is a 30-year U.S. project, is that the United States said we're unipolar, we do what we want, we expand militarily where we want, we expand our influence where we want. In 2008, the U.S. Said now we move NATO to Ukraine, to Georgia, and this is a replay, by the way, of the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, almost to the blueprint. And Russia said no, that's not going to happen. The point is, Europe got into line with it. The U.S. Strategists, if I could call them that, it's an exaggeration in my view, but the U.S. strategists said, we'll win because we're all powerful. What can Putin do? What can Russia do? Nothing. And they thought up until the end, and I know what they thought because I talked with them, I heard from them, I watched what they were saying. They thought in 2021, in the end, Russia won't resist. In 2022, well, if Russia does resist our push into Ukraine, our sanctions will bring the Russian economy to its knees. Well, if the sanctions don't work, our HIMARS and our ATACMS will do so. Oh, if that doesn't work, Russia won't mobilize to continue the fight. In other words, this was a group, in essence, playing a game, I would say, on the American side, which is we can do what we want.
Right.
That isn't the case. They lost that gambit. The Ukrainians tragically followed that line. I told the Ukrainians, of course, everyone knows Kissinger's famous line that to be an enemy of America is dangerous, to be a friend of America is fatal. I explained that to them. You're going to be like Afghanistan. Well, here we are.
Yeah.
They followed the U.S. Europe followed the U.S. Now they don't know quite what to do.
Yeah.
By Zelensky coming to Washington in this kind of pathetic way to sign over in almost a meaningless document half the mineral rights. This is just sad, desperate, confused. behavior. This is not strategy. This is not national policy. This is not continuing a war. This is nothing.
Well, it's back to business. I mean, war is a racket, as we've all heard before, Jeffrey, and I'm glad you brought that up, by the way, because apparently in just a few hours from now, Zelensky is going to be signing this so-called subsoil agreement with the Trump White House. But I was just going to say, what reckless policy, whether you go back to the Biden administration or the predecessor, Obama, and so on and so forth, what a reckless policy to pick a fight with the world's biggest nuclear power. You got to, I mean, I can't, like you said, how do we get our heads around this foreign policy that's been enacted over the past decade and, as you say, even 30 years? Now, you mentioned a moment ago about expanding influence. We all know the United States, and maybe we don't all know, but it's been meddling in, 70 or 80 elections in the past century. It is the #1 foremost meddler when it comes to sinking its teeth and sticking its fingers into other countries' democratic processes. Meantime, we're essentially watching Washington dismantling the old guard in real time. USAID being defunded. Its covert arm used to overthrow governments around the world is being chopped off. Jeffrey, I don't want to be an irrational optimist here, but is it possible we're going to see a new era of America perhaps respecting other countries and their political processes?
It's possible. It's far from assured. Believe me, it's far from assured. America still behaves with a lot of impunity. Frankly, even this shakedown of minerals, which I don't think will come to anything, by the way. I don't think this is more than a piece of paper on a gesture, on a photo op that means nothing. That's my own view. I may be wrong, but that's my own view, that this is meaningless. But it still is a kind of shakedown that is absolutely strange. President Trump, he talks about Canada, 51st state. He talks about Panama. He talks about Greenland. We're not at the end of provocations and so on by any means. But what I would say, and I mean this with the deepest seriousness, the major powers, the great powers, the United States, Russia, China, India, if Europe got its act together, should stop putting their noses right up against the other side and stop the provocations that could lead us to open war. This is the most important point. Going to Ukraine was such a provocation and blunder of the United States. Similarly, the way the U.S. acts vis-a-vis Taiwan is the same thing. That, if I could say, is the Ukraine of East Asia. Yeah. Don't provoke between the nuclear superpowers. For heaven's sake, this is the most basic point for our survival.
Yeah, meantime, we've seen essentially the G7 economies almost entirely being swapped out by the BRICS economies. When you look at the top 10 economies nowadays, you mentioned China and India and Russia, but some of the traditional European economies at the bottom now of the top 10 list. When you mentioned provocations a moment ago, let's just bring it back to USAID for a second. I mean, this whole scandal, it continues to shock the world. I mean, who would have thought, Jeffrey, honestly, who would have thought that USAID was financing all kinds of terror groups like ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, HTS in Syria? This is the country of the world that tells all of us it's fighting terrorism, Jeffrey.
USAID, very sadly, combined two completely different things. One was actually saving lives. Actually fighting malaria, actually fighting tuberculosis, doing important things. And then of course, it was used as a tool of U.S. foreign policy, and not saving lives, not doing development, not doing humanitarian things, but as a tool of U.S. manipulation. And they put the two things together, which is so sad, because we actually need the first, and the second was disgusting, provocative, causing war. You mentioned the interference in elections. I would say more generally, the U.S. interferes, whether it's democracies, non-democracies, the U.S. foreign policy for the post-war period, and by that war, I mean World War II, was that if you don't like the other side, you try to change the regime. Most countries have a different foreign policy, which is if you don't like the other side, you negotiate with them. You try to find a modus vivendi. But the United States was you meddle, you interfere, you overthrow, you destabilize, you cause a coup. This has to stop. There have been dozens and dozens and dozens of these regime change operations, and they end very, very badly.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, you look at this Russophobic agenda and the agenda against Russia. And of course, they've been trying to get rid of Putin for such a long time, trying to foment discontent and using the propaganda arm of the Western media to sell all these narratives and all these catchphrases. He's a dictator, he's this, he's that. And yet, Jeffrey, on a personal level, I lived in America many, many years. I grew up in the UK. I've been here in Russia now nearly 20 years. I've never experienced such a level of freedom in my life. I spent a number of years working for a major American news network. I won't mention their name. It's 3 letters. I won't mention it. But there I couldn't say certain things. Here in Russia, I can actually say what needs to be said. And you, by the way, you should be here on RT International on a permanent basis, Jeffrey, because you are brave enough to push back on these mainstream legacy media narratives. I guess, some people say you're making friends everywhere you go, tongue-in-cheek, Mr. Sachs.
Well, let me just say, since you started your life, I guess, in Britain, I feel the United States, I'm sorry to say it, I hope you won't take offense, but we learned everything we learned from Britain. And one of the fascinating points of our modern history is how it relates, as I said, to the 19th century. The Crimean War was a war led by Britain to try to push Russia out of the Black Sea region. This was the purpose of Lord Palmerston. He got Napoleon III to join him, and that was the outcome after the fall of Sevastopol, that for about 17 years, I think it was, Russia's fleet was out of the Black Sea. That's what they're trying to do again.
Yes.
And one of the fascinating things, and it's not going to work, but it is an echo of this 19th century. And one of the fascinating things with the Russophobia is British Russophobia, which Keith Starmer carries till today to the White House. And where does that Russophobia come from? There's a marvelous study from more than 50 years ago by a great historian who asked the question, where did British Russophobia arise? Because after all, in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain and Russia were allies. That was in 1815. By 1840, Britain regarded Russia as an enemy. And this historian asked the question, why in 25 years did that change? And when he studied it, there was no reason for the change other than Russia was a big, powerful country, and Britain resented that. As the British Empire, Britain simply resented Russia. It concocted all sorts of fables that Russia was going to invade India through the Khyber Pass and all the rest. But this is the U.S. situation as well, both vis-a-vis Russia, which I hope is now past, but also China, which is hate the other one simply for being big and successful. That's not a reason for Russophobia or Sinophobia. It's actually a reason for respect, for dialogue, for diplomacy, not for hatred. But we get the hatred stirred up, and it's not hard to stir up hatred.
Yeah, there are some people who go back even further than 50 years. They go back to the Great Game, as they like to call it, going back well over 100 years. Some people saying if Queen Victoria had been alive around the time of World War I, she wouldn't have allowed it to happen because of the bloodlines between the Romanovs and the British royal family. They were all essentially related. At the end of the day, it's fascinating you said to me that that Britain is still going for Odessa, still going for the Black Sea. Is that why London keeps talking about this 100-year contract with Ukraine?
That's interesting. I'm sorry to say, I don't mean to insult anybody, but the British position is unbelievably weird because Britain talks like it is the 19th century ruler of the world and that we're in Pax Britannica and that they're going to call the shots. It's over. Please stop. Calm down. Take a break. We don't need this nonstop war. We don't need Keith Starmer flying around the world to say we continue the war no matter what the United States does. He said in the White House, we'll put boots on the ground. Come on, calm down, please.
Yeah, it's amazing,
We
isn't
don't
it?
need this.
Yeah.
We don't need this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this guy, Keir Starmer, he was just in the White House. He got no love from Trump just now. And then, of course, Emmanuel Macron, he was there about 24 hours prior. He got no love from Trump either. It was quite entertaining to watch it, just for the entertainment value, frankly. But I wanted to bring you up to speed now that the latest talks in Istanbul, following the discussions in Riyadh between Russian and American officials. We are witnessing, as you said moments ago, a rapprochement. Do you really think there's a chance that a true peace can be arranged between Putin and Trump, regardless of the noisy chihuahuas in Europe?